Greetings! In this video we will model, rig, and animate a robot arm. The tools will be familiar to you, but some of the techniques and workflows will be new. Let's get started. We'll begin on our poly shelf and create our cylinder. We will come to the inputs in the channel box for the poly cylinder, and like so many of our primitives, we'll start with the subdivision axis of 8. Now we'll rotate this onto the side. You could do this interactively, and just a reminder that the J key, if you hold down the J key while we rotate, it's rotating in 15-degree increments, so it's very easy to get that quickly to 90. And of course, you could just type in 90 on the rotate Z. We're going to scale this up to 4 on the X and the Z, and then we'll scale the Y to 2. And this is our shoulder piece, or referred to sometimes as a hub, so our shoulder hub. Now we'll make a duplicate of this for our elbow. We'll come to Edit, Duplicate, and we're just going to drive that straight down. And you want to pick a whole number here for the translate Y. I'm going to say -17. That's a good distance between, based on this scale, between the shoulder and the elbow. You could make it longer or shorter, just make sure that it's a whole number. That makes grid snapping with our joints much more practical. Now we're going to scale this down a bit. We'll do 3 on X and Z and 1 on the Y. I'm going to go ahead and hide my grid in the perspective view and then turn on wireframe on shaded, make it a little easier to see. Now we're going to go to the front view and we'll scale out. We could select both items, hit the F key, and that centers it nicely in our view. We'll pick our elbow hub or cylinder, and we're going to grid snap it 1 unit in the -X direction so that it's off center. So here's our center line. We've moved it 1 unit. You can verify that here in the channel box. So just a quick review of our two shapes. Our elbow is -1X, -17 on the translate Y. It's rotated 90, and then we don't have inputs because it's a duplicate. Here's our original cylinder as our shoulder. It's sitting at the origin. It's rotated Z90. Scale XYZ is 424, and our subdivision axis is 8. And we can turn on wireframe in this front view. Now we'll move on to beveling. We're going to bevel each, and we're going to do it separately since the bevel is a fraction of the total size. So we want to do that on each shape originally, rather than doing it once and then duplicating. So I've shift double clicked both of those. Let's hit the F key, get in there. This is our original cylinder, and we've just got those outside edges selected. 5 key, we'll come to the modeling toolkit, and this is very familiar to you. We'll hit bevel, and we'll leave it at 0.5 for now, and we'll just increase the segments to 2. I'm going to click on the panel, hit the Q key, and then hit the 3 key, and we can see that's the shape we're starting with. And we'll do it here for the elbow piece. We'll right click to edges, double click, shift double click the other side. We can hit the 4 key to verify that selection. 5 key, we'll hit bevel, and right, this fraction is 0.5, but it's 0.5 of a smaller piece, so that's why we're doing it a second time rather than having duplicated. And we'll put in our segments 2. We'll click on the panel, hit the Q key, and now we can right click and get back to object mode, and we can look at that in the 3 as well. Now this is a good place to increment and save because you may want to come back here and experiment. You could also select both items, duplicate them, create a layer, and then hide them away. In case you make a mistake, work yourself into a corner. This is a good plateau to come back to begin. We are going to detail out these two pieces. We'll begin with the shoulder hub or cylinder, and we're going to grab the center faces. And I just did that, right? In an orthographic view, it would be very clean to draw that bounding box selection, and you make sure you're not going to get anything accidentally selected. You can hit the 4 key just to verify that. We'll hit the 6 key, and we'll come to the modeling toolkit, and we'll hit extrude. And we're going to drive the offset down to 1.5, or up to 1.5, I should say. And I want to delete this, but again, because I've been typing here, if I hit delete, it thinks I'm typing. So we'll click on the panel, hit the Q key, and now I'm free to hit delete. And we can see we've got a hole through our cylinder, through our shoulder hub. And we'll create a sphere, and we'll create some interesting shapes out here. We'll come to poly modeling, create our sphere. We'll slide it out in the positive X direction. Once again, I'm going to rotate onto the side. J key allows me to do that quickly in the interactive view. And then you can just verify in the channel box that that's 90, and or you could just type in 90. Now we're going to come to the inputs and we're going to make this 8. Remember, as we're starting modeling, 8 is a good starting point. And because we chose 8 here, we're choosing 8 on the sphere, and we'll be able to attach these objects together without problem. Go ahead and hit the Q key, and we're going to divide this sphere into half. You can select an edge and detach and then separate, which you should be familiar with that workflow. Here's an example of when we would use the edit mesh extract method. So something to jot down in your notes, that edges are detached and then separated, whereas faces can just be extracted. So it's a one-step method for the extract, where it's a two-step method for the edge. So you're detaching edges or you're extracting faces. In this instance, selecting those faces was pretty easy. In other instances, double-clicking that edge and getting the total loop is more practical. So it just depends on the model and the circumstance. But I've got these faces selected, and I'll hit extract. And now, right-click to object mode, we can see that we have two pieces of geometry now, and we'll slide this onto the other side where we'll make that attachment. And then we're going to move this into proximity. I'm going to select everything and just hit 1. This makes snapping a little bit easier to see. And we're going to snap this in proximity here, and we'll make that X arrow active, right? We see green and we see blue or Z. The green represents Y. Our X, which is red, is now yellow, which means we're constrained in that direction. And I can hold the V key, and with my middle mouse button, snap that right there. Now there's a little bit of a detail here. This shape is rounded out. And when you have these two kind of rounded shapes, if we were to make the attachment now, the bridge would not function how we might anticipate. Let me just demonstrate that. So don't do this. Let me just show you. If we were to come and say combine, so now they're a singular piece, and we double click this edge, shift double click this edge, and you're familiar with the bridge tool, you can see that it bridged wrong. So I'm going to undo that, undo back to the point before we make the combination. So we're back to them being separate. We'd snapped it here, right? And that's where the problem is. It's sitting a little bit inside of that round. So we're just going to manually slide it out a bit. We're not following any references, so it's fine to kind of do some of these techniques by eye. But we've pulled it out far enough, and now you'll see when we hit combine and then double click this edge, shift double click this edge, and when we hit bridge, it bridges as we would expect it to. We'll do the same on the other side. Maybe for this one, we'll scale it up a little bit. And just so that you know how to snap, right, we're limiting ourselves. We can hold down the V key. We get it right on there. And then we're just going to slide it back a little bit. We'll shift select both. We'll hit combine. And then this is a little bit more difficult selection. You could come inside to grab that edge and then shift select that edge. In either case, right, you can hit the 4 key and certainly see those two. And we'll hit bridge. We'll hit the 5 key. And we made that a little bit larger. We can actually create a ball bearing. This will be on the torso side. So how the shoulder articulating this way makes sense, but we also might need to raise the shoulder. So ultimately we could create a ball joint here as well. Now we can detail out a little bit, make this a little bit more interesting just by extruding. So I'm going to select that face. You could select all the way around, but I can shift double click, and that gives me the components in between. So I've got that selection. And then let's hit extrude. And I'm doing this in the 1 mode, easier to see. And let's say we offset just let's say 0.2. And we'll extrude a second time, and let's pull this out. We'll pull out on the Z, or you could scrub out on the Z. And now when I hit the 3 key, you see that's made it a little bit more interesting. We can do the same on the other side. In this case, let's have it come inward since the other one went outward. We'll hit the 4 key, and oops, I did get some bad selection, so I'll just Control key, bounding box to deselect those. That's the reason we always want to hit the 4 key, just to check. And we'll hit Extrude, we'll drive the offset down, and then we'll hit Extrude a second time, and we'll extrude, push the local Z in. And it's probably better for you to be doing this in the 1 mode, just so that you don't get overlapping faces as we're scrubbing the offset and the Z. I'll click on the panel, right, to get out of here, hit the Q key, and now I'm free to go back to the object mode, and we'll hit the 3 key. And we've got an interesting shape. This is on the torso side, this is on the outside. And you can experiment with those techniques, but come away with something similar to that. Now you're following this this lesson pretty closely. You will create a custom robot, so don't feel that you're constrained. We're just learning these techniques today, but you'll be free to create any kind of robot that you want for your final projects. Okay, let's do something similar here. We're going to grab those same interiors. We can dolly around and see, hit the 4 key to make sure that's a clean selection. And then we'll hit Extrude, and let's do this in the 1 mode. We'll drive the offset down, and in this case, let's be precise. Let's say 1.5. We want a nice small space there. And I want to delete these faces, but again, because I've typed, the keyboard is in input mode. So I click on the panel to get out of that. Then I can hit the Q key to get out of that tool. Remember, when we're using these, it's always a good idea as soon as you're done to hit the Q key, panel, Q key, and then we'll hit delete. And then we will bridge this interior. So I'm going to select that. You can see what I have selected there. We'll shift select the other side, 5 key, and then we will hit bridge. And if you hit the 3 key, we're going to use this elbow. There'll be 2 pieces, and we'll put a bolt in between there. And so we might want to play with some beveling. Let's do these 2 at once. So just those same edges, and we'll hit bevel. Well, let's leave the fraction at 0.5, and we'll drive that to 2. Hit the 3 key. Actually, let's drive the fraction down a little bit, make that a little bit tighter. So I've gone to 0.3 and 2. And then we can play that same, let's do the opposite of up here. So we went in here, so let's go out here. We'll grab, I've selected this face, shift double click the next one to the one next to it, and it has completed everything in between. 4 key to check, 5 key. We'll hit extrude, we'll drive the offset a little bit, best to do this in the 1 mode. And then we said we're going to drive this one out on a second extrusion. So let's extrude a second time and then drive it out on the Z. Hit the 3 key and see how you like that. It might be a little bit far. I'm going to go to 0.2. And I like the way that looks. All right, just some visual variety there. And then we'll do this one and we'll pull this one in. Especially since this is going to be right up against the other part of the elbow. So we'll hit extrude, we'll drive the offset, best to do it in the 1, we'll hit extrude a second time, and we'll drive the Z inward. I did a negative 0.4, and that looks good. So there is, oops, now look, I've got, I had a bad selection on that side. So I'm going to undo, there we go. I must not have checked, or if I did, I didn't see it. So I've just undone back, and I've used my control key to select. And that's a great example of why you want to hit that 4 key, because when you're making face selections, you might accidentally get something on the other side, which is what I just did. So we'll hit extrude, and once again, we'll drive that offset, best done in the 1 mode, and you can see why it's better in the 1 mode. And then we'll extrude a second time, and we'll drive the Z, and we're going inward on this side. All right, 3 key, and there is our elbow piece. And now we'll connect these two. So we can either make the deletions first, then combine, and then bridge, or delete first. It doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and combine them first. So we'll combine, and then we're going to pick the middle two on the bottom. So take a look at that, right? That's the bottom of the shoulder, those two faces. And then we're going to pick the two next to it in the negative X side. This is on the torso side, right? And we're just going to hit delete, and I'm going to hit the 1 key. So we've deleted those faces because we're going to bridge here. So we'll pick on this one, on the elbow, the top two, make sure that you're on the top, and then the two in the negative X direction on the body side, torso side, and we'll hit delete. And now we have the same number opening, and because we've already combined it, we can just pick the edges. So I've double clicked that edge, and that just went all the way around, and then we'll shift double click this edge, and we'll hit bridge. Now, before you click off with the options still open, hit the 3 key. And we can see, because there aren't any edges in this intermediary space, these faces, this curve is really being pulled. And so let's relax that by adding divisions. And we'll put in 3 divisions here. So I just scrubbed up to 3, or you could click in there and type 3. And you see now that that circle follows a lot more closely. I'm going to hit the panel, hit the Q key, right click to object mode. And we can dolly around and look at that shape. Now, it was averaging these two, and so just to kind of clean this up, we can double click this edge, and anytime you want to straighten out a series of components, you can grab the scale tool and then just scale it straight down until it doesn't go anymore. And now that's straight. And I'll double click this one on the bottom, and again, we'll drive it down on the Y with the scale tool, and now it's straight. So that model looks a little bit cleaner with those straight lines going across and the circle following the contour more closely. So there is our upper arm, and we're just going to create a duplicate for the lower arm. As you begin to develop more sophisticated shapes and modeling skills, you could create a completely different forearm from the elbow down to the wrist. But we're just going to use a duplicate. And before we duplicate this, we want to put the pivot right in the middle here on that grid line. So let's jump into the front view. We'll come into the object view, and here I've got the move tool selected, and I'm just going to tap the D key. And because we're on the grid, remember we moved our cylinder down negative 17 units. You could have done negative 16 or negative 18, but we wanted to be on the grid. This is one of the reasons that we can just grid snap this down here. Now, I always tell you not to drag, so let me follow my own advice. I'm going to hold down the X key and the middle mouse button snap right there, and that's where we want the pivot for the piece. I'll tap the D key to get out of there. And why did we want that pivot there? One of the reasons, or the reason right now, is we can just duplicate this. We'll come to Edit, Duplicate, and then with our Rotate tool, and we'll hold the J key, increment 15. Now we've rotated that down, and we've got our forearm, or our lower arm, automatically in place. And so this is our kind of elbow mechanism where we can raise the forearm right from there. Now let's create just a simple bolt piece. We'll use a cylinder, same kind of workflow. Let's jump into the front view so that we can grid snap this, and I'll hit the 4 key so we can see that. So there's my new cylinder, and we'll grid snap it down into place, get in there nice and tight. And we want our subdivisions to be 8. We want to rotate it onto its side. You could put the 90 in, or I'm holding down the J key and just rotating this over. Got it? Negative 90 on the Z in this case. And then we'll just arbitrarily scale that out a little bit further. Right, we could have put in the numbers there, maybe a 3.5 or something like that. But it's easy enough to just scale this to the exact size that you want. So I'm grabbing that edge, and we're going to bevel these outer edges, and we'll make a great big bevel. We'll come to the modeling toolkit, we'll hit bevel, and we'll leave that at 0.5. Then let's give ourselves, let's even say 3 segments. We'll hit the 3 key just to see how that looks, and that looks good. We'll right click to object mode, click the panel, hit the Q key, right click to object mode. And right, we've got that bolt in between combining the two. Now this is another good place to save, increment and save. We're going to be creating the mechanism for a hook or claw type mechanism for which will represent our hand. So increment and save, and we'll keep going. So for this, we're going to, I'm going to select this face, and we could select all the way around, but we're going to shift and get to this face. So that's what we have selected. And we're going to, in the modeling toolkit, we're going to extrude, and we're going to drive the offset. Let's go into the 1 mode, and we're going to give ourselves a 0.4 offset. And in this case, we want a little bit more detail here because we're going to be extruding this inward. So I'm going to add a division. And you can see that that's the equivalent of having just extruded twice along the existing face. So take a look at that. In fact, let me just do that again. I selected this face, shift, pick a face, shift double click, it'll get you all the way around, or you could manually select with the shift key. We're coming to extrude. We're going to offset 0.4, if I can get that there, and then we're going to add a division. So take a look, just as we add a division, that gave us an extra loop around. And now we'll extrude with those same faces selected. We'll extrude again. We're going to hit extrude, and we're going to drive this back on the Z, in the negative Z direction, about a -3, I would say. And now we have the interior space, and this is where our hooks or clamps will go. Now if we hit the 3 key, this looks nice around here, but up at the top, it's really faceting. It's making a 180-degree turn on one face, which isn't a good idea. So let's give it an additional edge. Now, we haven't used the edge loop tool yet in this lesson, but you should be familiar with it. The multi-cut tool with the option key gives us the edge loop. And just a quick review. So I have the multi-cut, and you always want to be careful with the multi-cut because you can easily cut and make additional edges and not even necessarily see it till later. So be careful when you've got the multi-cut active. And you can see as I hold down the control key, it turns into an edge loop tool. And it's perpendicular to the edge that you're on, which can be a little bit confusing. So that's why I'm reviewing it here. And we want it running vertically. We want it running up and down. And we also want to snap it right in the middle. So I think by default your snap step is 10. Go ahead and type in 50. And to engage the snap step, that is the shift key. So with my multi-cut tool, I'm holding 2 keys. I'm holding the control key to engage the edge loop tool, and then I'm holding the shift key to engage the snap step, which is currently set to 50%. So with both the control and shift key selected, I'll click, and that has added an edge loop. Now it's gone all the way around. You always want to be careful about adding edge loops if you don't really need it, but we did want an additional bit of geometry there, and that makes that curvature a little bit more clean. All right, now we'll move on to the hook or clamp, and again, increment and save, but we'll go ahead and get going. We're going to start with a pipe. We'll say create polyprimitives pipe. We'll jump into the front view. Jump into the front view. It's sitting there in the middle. And let's just grid snap it down into place or into proximity. We're going to have to play with the position. And let's take a look at that here. I'll hit the F key. So there is the pipe shape. And once again, we'll come to the inputs, and we want this to be 8. And we also want it on its side. So we're holding the J key and rotating that up, or typing 90 in manually. And we're going to put the translate, well, I'm going to put it a little bit lower. So we're going to say 40. And this is because of the animation exercise that we're going to do. We're going to start with everything at 90 degree, and we're going to have it rotate progressively less and come to a stop. So we need enough room for this to be able to rotate up 90 degrees. So I've set it a little bit lower. So if you followed me from the beginning, we started at the origin, we made the elbow -17. Now we're creating this clamp and we've set it to translate Y -40. Let's scale this up. Let's say 4. And then on the Y, we'll start with 1. We might want to scale that wide. But that looks like that fits right there. So 4, 1, and 4. So just a quick look at the channel box. We created a pipe. It's down -40 units on the Y. It's rotated 90 degrees, and it's 414 on the scale. And the subdivision axis, like all of our primitives starting, are at 8. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete 1/2. Yeah, we'll go ahead and delete 1/2. We're going to do some detailing on this, and rather than do it twice, we'll just duplicate and mirror it. And I want to get in here. I don't have anything on layers. If you'd been creating layers, you could hide that away. But don't forget we have the isolate select. So this tool here, I've got this half pipe selected. It is selected. Now when I click isolate select, everything disappears except for what I had selected. I'll hit the F key, and we can see when we deleted that other half, there's a hole here. So that's the first thing we'll do. We'll double click that edge, shift double click that edge. I'll hit the 4 key, let you see that. And then we'll come up to mesh fill hole, mesh fill hole. Come back to 5 just so that you can see that. And with those edges selected, let's bevel. So I'm going to shift double click this kind of C shape, shift double click the inner C shape, and then on the other side, shift double click the inner, shift double click the outer. And it might be easier just to see what those blue unselected, right? So the blue edges are unselected edges and the orange are the selections. And we'll just go back to our handy bevel, and we'll just make sure that the segments are 2. We'll leave the fraction at 0.5. And you can hit the 3 key and you can see how that has remained hard. And now we've got a kind of clamp-like shape. Now, in terms of mirroring it, because we want the objects to remain separate, we're not going to use the mesh mirror function. We're going to duplicate it, and we could duplicate it in place. I'll say edit, duplicate, and then in the channel box, right, we see here pipe 1, pipe 2. We're on pipe 2, and if I come to the Z, if we look here, this is the direction we want to mirror across. We can put in a negative, so a -4 on the scale Z, and it's flipped over. If I'd put -4, -1, -4, it would be a complete mirror. But in this case, we're just putting the negative on the single axis we want to mirror across, which is the Z. Okay, now let's bring back our arm. And before we continue, let's engage in a little bit of housekeeping. We've got our transform nodes here, so we'll come to Edit, Delete All by Type History. And we're going to name these. When you are rigging, it's always helpful to name. And you want to name with the noun first and the adjective second. So I'm going to say arm upper, and this would be arm lower, or you could say forearm. We'll call this elbow bolt. And it's a little bit of time up front to name everything. We'll say clamp front. I'll just put an F there. But it's actually a time saver ultimately because it saves you from making mistakes. We'll say clamp, oops, double click, clamp, and we'll say R for rear. So F and R. So just naming convention, best or good idea, good habit to put the noun and then the adjective. So arm upper, arm lower, elbow bolt, clamp front, clamp right. And there we have the pieces. Now we'll leave it as it is here. So you definitely want to get to this point. We would increment and save. And in the next section of the video, we will move on to rigging with a joint chain. Okay, be right back. Greetings, welcome back. Before we move on to rigging, I think the clamp can be a little bit larger, just as I look at this here. So let's pick each of them. We'll make it 5 instead of 4. So I'm putting 5 on the X and 5 on the Z. We'll do the same here. 5 on the X, and then we'll be careful, we have to also put in the -5. And that is a little bit more in proportion. We'll leave the 1, and that's fitting in there nicely. So sorry about that. I initially said 4, 1, 4, but it's simple enough to change it to 5, 1, and 5. All right, let's get started. Now, one of the reasons that we took advantage of the grid was so that when we lay down our joints, they will be perfectly in line. And we'll come up to the rigging mode, switching from modeling to rigging. And we're going to open the joint tool. So skeleton, create joints. We'll open that dialog box. And I'm going to hit reset here. By default, it is local axis direction. And we will talk about local versus world space for your joints. But for a very simple robot like this, or robot arm, we will use world space. So we're going to click Orient Joint to World. We won't have any issues with axis direction or rotation handles. So we're going to use Orient Joint to World. And if you want to get in here nice and tight, we can see the center line, and we'll hold down the X key and click. So we've laid that joint. Now you can change the size of your joints. Sometimes they're hard to see. You can come to Display, Animation, Joint Size, and I'm going to, let's say, put that up to 2. Just make it a little bit easier to see. Again, that was Display, Animation, Joint Size. Okay, we'll close that. And I've still got the tool active. You can see that the joint tool is still active, so I'm still building a chain here. And we're just going to come straight down and grid snap right in the middle, right? So that is, you can see here it says joint 2 is negative 17 units, which is where we had put our elbow. And then we'll come down to the center of our wrist. We'll consider this our wrist, and we'll grid snap there. And there is our joint chain. Return when we're done. I'll click on the panel, return when we're done. I'll hit the Q key, and there is a very simple 3-joint chain: a shoulder joint, a elbow, and a wrist. And out of good habit, especially as you're learning, we'll name these, and we'll put J at the end of each one, so we remember, or if you're doing any kind of programming or you're looking at nodes in a different window, you can see at a glance that it's a joint. And we'll say wrist joint. So we've got everything labeled here, and this will make the rigging go pretty quickly. Remember that when we're rigging, having two identical windows side by side, with one showing the polys and the other showing your joints, is probably the best bet. And so this icon here is our 2 windows side by side, and we're going to make them both the perspective. So we have two perspective windows sitting next to each other. I'll go ahead and hide the grid on that new one. And let's just go to Show None. And then in this one, we'll show our polys. So we'll say Show Polys. So if you look at Show, that whole list is invisible except for polys. And we'll come to the opposite here. We're going to say Show None. And then we'll say Show Joints. So if you look at that long list, everything is off except joints. And right when we dolly and track and navigate, you see that both windows are updating. And this makes selecting much easier. Selecting joints when the surfaces are active is visually difficult as a beginner, and there is opportunity for mistake or misparenting. We'll also, as a beginner, probably best to start at the bottom. Here's a confusing thing about the way that the skeleton is color-coded. If I pick the shoulder, I only have the shoulder selected, but the downstream joints are highlighted. And most beginners will look at this and think that 3 joints are selected. So really important, I know that 3 joints aren't selected because they would be white. Remember that when we have multiple selections, the previous are white. So because there's no white, I know I only have 1 joint. The other way that I know is if I had a multiple selection here in the channel box, there would be ... So because there isn't a dot, 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 it means I have shoulder J is the only thing selected. And then, of course, you can look in your outliner and see. If I select all three, right, now we see the two white and the green. And if we look in the channel box, we see the dot, dot, dot. So because that can be confusing, it's better to start at the bottom. Because if we start at the bottom, right, it's only the down chain that are highlighted. So it's just a little bit easier to see. You can parent in any direction, but I'm advocating that we start at the bottom because if we start at the top, sometimes it's confusing to know what you have selected. But make note of that. If everything is selected, we would see white joints. The last one selected is green. We'd see dot, dot, dot. All right, so what goes where? Well, and can be a little bit confusing too. Your hand is controlled by your wrist joint, right? Your forearm is controlled by your elbow joint. Your upper arm is controlled by your shoulder joint. So it's downstream, and that's another reason we wanted to name everything. So I've grabbed both these clamps, and then a word here. For this particular exercise, this clamp isn't going to open and close. If we wanted to make it open and close, and I'll show you how to do this, ultimately, we would need two joints. We just have one joint for the wrist. Again, we want to create this joint chain where there's progressive fall off coming to a stop. So that's our goal here. But many students create all kinds of sophisticated hands, and we would need multiple joints to have this clamp open and close. So it's just going to be parented right to the wrist joint. And you can select here. If you're selecting here, remember that the command key allows you to skip select, because if I just grabbed those two clamps and then held down the shift key and tried to pick the wrist, everything in between would also be selected. So if we're in the outliner, we would select our clamps and then hold down the command key and pick the wrist. Of course, I'm going to do it interactively here. So I've got my clamps, and the order selection is essential. The children are selected first, and the parent is selected last. So these two clamp geometry are the children of the joint. So I'm selecting them first, shift selecting the joint, take a look here in the outliner, and then you can hit lowercase p. I'll go the long way just so that we can see it being executed. We'll come to Edit Parent. And you want to test, especially as an introductory student, you want to test each parent. So I'll select this joint now, and I can see that I can now rotate that clamp. And even though we haven't done the others, right, I can raise or rotate my elbow, and I can rotate my shoulder as well, and that is following. And so we'll go to the next, right, which is our lower arm. And where does this go? Well, it goes to the elbow. So we'll select that elbow there. Arm lower and elbow. Selection order is important or essential. We picked the child first, the geometry. We shift selected the parent second, which in this case is the joint. Lowercase p on the keyboard, or I'll come the long way, Edit Parent. And we can test that, right? We can rotate that now. Oops. And let's see why that. There we go. My graphics card kind of got sketchy there. It wasn't raising the hand, but I clicked off and clicked back on and it updated. So, and we can pick both joints. We can pick the elbow and the wrist, and we can rotate it. And this is what we'll be doing as we animate. We're going to have this arm fall down and come eventually to a stop. Also, because the joints were created in world space, we can have them both selected and rotate on the same axis. So I'll undo back. Now we also have that bolt, and we'll put that also on the elbow so that we see it rotating in there. So I'll pick the elbow bolt, shift select the elbow. So we're parenting, again, two things to a singular joint. And we'll come to Edit Parent. Two things total, I should say. So you can see that wrist joint has two geometry. Clamp F and clamp R are parented in. The elbow has two geometry, arm lower and elbow bolt. And as I just mentioned, you want to rotate, especially with that little quirkiness in the graphics card. And we can pick them both, and we can see that that's working. And then finally, we'll pick the upper arm, Best to do your selections with the Q or select tool, and we'll shift select that shoulder joint and lowercase p, or go the long way, edit parent. And that's our basic rig. Let's just test it. We'll pick the 3 joints, right? Or I could just have click drag here in the outliner. We'll grab our rotate tool and we'll rotate that on the X. And you can see that that's working, and we're going to have it fall back and then eventually come to a stop. Anytime we want to get back, we can just zero out that rotate X. So there is our rig, right? And in the next section of the video, we will animate. All right, be right back. Greetings, welcome back. We have our chart here, just a quick explanation. The first column are our frames, just running by 10. The second column is the actual value of the rotate X. And then the third column is the rounded value that we'll actually use. We arrived at these, 90 degrees is where we will start, and we multiply that by 0.66, which gives us about 60. 60 times 0.66 gives us about 40. And then it's alternating negative and positive. So each of these values multiplied by 0.66 gives us the next value until it eventually comes to a complete rest. So that's how we get a progressive fall off. And you'll see how it appears as though the energy is dissipating through the rig or through the system. Now, we don't have to animate all 3, we just have to animate the shoulder, and then we'll copy and paste in the graph editor, and then we'll offset in the graph editor. So let's start. We'll pick the shoulder, make sure that the shoulder joint is active. Now, if you hit the plus key here in the outliner, it only opens the next set of nodes. So if we want to open all of this, we'll hold down the shift key and click the plus, and now we can see everything. We're animating the shoulder joint, and then we'll copy and paste to the elbow and the wrist. So make sure you're on the shoulder joint. We want to have 0 frames. So we're starting at 0 frames, and we're running through 120. So we're animating 0 to 110, and then when we offset, we'll need that extra 10 frame for that offset space. I'll go ahead and maximize the window that has my geometry in it. We'll scale back a little bit. And right, we can see here frame 0, the rounded value X, rotate X is negative 90. So we'll manually type that in. And we're also going to just use the S method. Remember that when we're setting keys, we move in time, we manipulate the object, and we set the keyframe. As we just did, we moved in time to frame 0. We manipulated the object, we typed in negative 90 on the rotate X, and now we'll set the keyframe. You could set it directly there by right-clicking. It'll go a little bit quicker if we just hit S on the keyboard. So I'm just hitting S on the keyboard, and we can see the red now indicating that there is a key channel coming in. And what's the next frame? Well, it's 10. We're working by 10. And what's the next value? 60. And then when you hit return, you should be able to hit S, but sometimes it'll get stuck in the field, so not a bad idea just to click on the panel before you hit S. We'll come to 20, and here we are at 20. What's the value? Negative 40. So we'll hit negative 40, we'll hit return. Good habit, just clicking on the panel and hitting S. 30, and we'll try to breeze through these. So this would be 25 the value. Click on the panel, hit the S. Move in time to frame 40. This is negative 17. Click on the panel, hit the S. We'll come to frame 50. We've got 50 here, 11. Click on the panel, hit the S. We'll come to 60. 60 is negative 7, so progressively smaller until it comes to a rest. Hit the panel, hit the S. Frame 70, the value is 5. And we'll hit S. We'll come to frame 80. 80 is negative 3. 90. 90 is 2, and actually these very small values really add to the realism of all of your animation. We'll come to frame 100, negative 1, click on that panel, hit S, 110, and this is at our final rest of 0. And we'll hit S, and we'll press play. Now it's going to play too fast. We need to open our preferences if you had restored your default, and then switch the playback speed to 24 frames per second times 1. And we'll press play. And so there it is. Now it looks very stiff because we haven't animated the elbow or wrist. but it does appear as though it's rotating and coming to a rest because of this progressive fall off. All right, let's copy and paste that to the elbow and to the wrist, and then we'll give it an offset, which will create a chain reaction, a very natural animation. I'm going to press stop, going to come to frame 0, and let's open the animation, window animation editor, graph editor. Now, there are a number of static channels here. That is keys where the value does not change, and we can see that here. When we just hit S, we got a key on everything in the channel box. So we'll get rid of that. I think it was probably quicker to just use the S key, and then now with one foul swoop, up on the main menu to come to Edit, Delete All by Type Static Channels. And that gets rid of that and leaves us with the Rotate X. Some word here, review about navigating in the graph editor. We can use our option right to zoom in and out. We can use our option middle to track up, down, left, and right. You can also click on the value and hit the F key, and that should fill the window. And then there's a unique to the graph editor. You can hold the shift option, and then you can scrub with your right mouse button, left and right, and that will also spread things out to help you navigate in the graph editor window. But probably your best bet just to grab all of the keys and hit the F key. That's probably the most straightforward way. And with all those keys selected, I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit and just make sure all those keys are selected. And we're going to come to Edit Copy. Note we're not up on the main menu this time. We're on the Edit menu of the graph editor. So we're going to come to Edit Copy. With those selected, right, you have to have them selected to copy them. Edit, Copy. And then we're going to switch to the elbow joint. So I'll move this over. We just want to come to the elbow joint. And here's the trick. We can't just hit paste. We need to establish at least one keyframe for this to paste into, because it doesn't know where we want to paste it. And we also want to be at frame 0. So we want our first key at frame 0. So we're going to create, right, once again, I'm on the elbow joint. We don't have any animation yet on our elbow joint. And in the channel box, I'm going to come to Rotate X, right click, this time we will use the right click method, and hit Key Selected. So elbow joint, in the channel box, I've right clicked on Rotate X, and now if you look in the graph editor, you can see that single keyframe there, sitting at frame 0. We are at frame 0, make sure that you're at frame 0 in the timeline, and now we can come to Edit Paste, and again, this is on the graph editor, not the main menu. Edit Paste, and it's come in a little funny, so I'm going to use that method of Shift Option, and using my right mouse button with Shift Option and pulling horizontally, and that allows me to get a better handle on that. I can draw a bounding box and then hit the F. So there we go. And if we watch it now, I'm going to minimize that. If we watch it play now, right now the elbow is also animated. But it's animated in perfect sync. And in a joint chain, oftentimes the subordinate joints are delayed, and that gives us a chain reaction. So take a view here, and you may even want to increment and save so that you could come back and compare. Let's offset that. So we'll delay that action on the elbow joint just by a few frames, let's say 3 frames. If you want to do, you probably wouldn't do less than that, but if you wanted to do a few more than that, you can find a chain reaction that you like. But I'm on elbow joint, right? I'm not on the shoulder joint. I'm on the elbow joint, right? We can zoom out, grab everything, hit the F key, new command, which is Shift Option, right mouse button, right? And we've got that in view. And we're going to move it over 3 frames. This can be a little tricky. In fact, I'm going to come to frame 0 just so it's a little bit easier to see. I've grabbed all those frames. I'm on the elbow joint. These are the newly pasted keys. And I'm going to use my move tool. So just our regular move tool. And the shift key will constrain us horizontally or vertically based on the initial direction. So in the graph editor, right, up and down is changing the value, left and right is changing the timing. So very rarely do you do those two things at the same time. So the shift middle mouse button horizontally is allowing you to change the time. The shift middle mouse button vertically up and down is allowing you to change the value. We don't want to change the values, we just want to change the time. So we're going to move horizontally down about 3 frames. I'll hold the shift key and middle mouse button, and it started moving there. I'll put it back to where it was, and we'll just count 1, 2, 3. I'm going to hit undo. The other thing, um, sometimes, at least on my Mac, this can be finicky, and you might have to just click and drag hard once, and then once it's in the moving mode, then you can come back and create a little bit more subtle movement. But here I am, right? Here's my first key at 0, and I'm going to go 1, and there it just did it. What I was mentioning: 1, 2, 3. And I know that I got that. The last one is what's indicated here. It says the stats are 113. Right? What was that final key at 110 is now 113. And so we can verify that we moved 3 frames. And just having moved those 3 frames, when we watch it play, you can see that that's more natural. It's a chain reaction. It's not a locked reaction. So it's as if the energy is having an effect downstream of our rig. Okay, and then we'll just do that same thing on the wrists. So we'll come to the wrist. We know that we have to establish the first key, and we have to do that at the beginning. So frame 0, wrist joint is selected, rotate X is selected, and we'll right click and say key selected, because we have to establish the first frame to have something to paste into. We'll open our graph editor, and right there is wrist joint, rotate X, there is that first key. We're at frame 0. And we'll go ahead and paste. It's still in our memory, so we'll say edit paste, and it gave us kind of that funny view. So shift option, right mouse button, then I'll zoom out, maybe a little bit more of that, grab everything. Oops, missed that. We'll hit the F key, and so that kind of framed it better. Now this again went to 0, and so we'll move it 3 more. We're going to move this a total of 6. So I'm at frame 0, wrist joint, we'll draw a bounding box around all the keys, shift middle mouse button, and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you look up here, you can see that it says 116, because that last frame, that last keyframe that was at 110, we've moved it down 6, and so it's indicating that if we came and just grabbed the first one, we'd see that now it's starting at 6. And in fact, you can grab all 3, right? I've grabbed all 3 joints, and now you see that offset. So the initial action starts here, and then it has an effect downstream, the elbow, and then the elbow has the effect downstream onto the wrist. And now when we watch it, we'll click off there, we get a nice natural flow, and it'll come to a stop by 120. So that notion of decreasing with a decrease, you can use that in all kinds of chain reaction to your animation. And it doesn't have to be 0.66. It just has to be any value less than 1, right? So we can make this faster or slower based on the multiplier here. Okay, so render this out, and you can turn this in at this point either as a full MPEG-4, or if you want to continue just using the animated GIF workflow. In the next little section, it should be reviewed to you by now, but we'll set this up and let's do an Arnold render for this one. All right, be right back. Have a good one. Welcome back. Let's render this out. This should be review. But we're going to draw a bounding box around the geometry. Note that I only have polys on, so I was able to draw a bounding box. If I had everything on, when you draw a bounding box, joints take priority. So you can see here that bounding box selection selected joint, shoulder joint. So we'll continue to work with everything off except the polys, just to make this easy. So I'm going to right click. And actually, let's assign, since we know we're rendering an Arnold, let's go ahead and assign a standard surface. So I'm in the Arnold menu, Arnold standard surface. And we'll come to Arnold and we'll create our sky dome. And then we'll open the Arnold render here and we'll get this to update. We'll press play. And so that's light. We'll pull down the intensity. And then it's flat, so that's why we want to create then a directional light. And even just that default position, we can tap the T key and give ourselves a little bit of an offset. And remember that our overarching goal is to see the volume of the shape. And so that looks pretty good. Right, we can kind of see those highlights. Now the other advantage to rendering in Arnold, right, if I hit the 1 key, it's going back to the coarse mode. So I can hit 3 without actually having subdivided it, and Arnold will render the subdivided preview. And we can scrub through here, and you want to make sure that everything is in view. So at frame 0, I'm missing that. We can also turn on our resolution gate. And so we'll make sure that the beginning is in and make sure that it doesn't come down too far. So that's about it, and we'll just zoom out. So there is a view where we can see everything. And why don't we change the color? I'll come to the AI standard surface, and we can just choose any color we'd like. Let's say we'll make that blue. And it's in all the area, and yeah, feel free to play around. And that's kind of cool there, right? Because you can see different areas where the shadows might land. All right, and once you've established the lights, right, we just have a sky dome and one directional light. We turn down the intensity of the sky dome, but we actually didn't change anything on the directional light. If you wanted, right, if you were a stickler about the quality of your shadow, you could turn up the samples, and then if you wanted a real soft shadow, you would increase the angle. But this is fine. This is more about evaluating your rig and animation. Now, if you're rendering full screen, right, if you've got Premiere up and running or another video application, you can go to the full screen, 1920 by 1080. If you haven't got Premiere up and running, or you don't have probably 960 by 540 or even a 540 square. Actually, that should all fit in there. And now we need to kind of rearrange. Yeah, the 512 square actually gives us a little bit more of a view. So if you're doing an animated GIF, that, well, I said 540. Let's make it a nice 512. Okay. So yeah, that square is better suited to this animation. And a quick review, right? You want to name it. We want these to be JPEGs. It is name dot number dot extension. We're going from 0 to 120. We are rendering our perspective view, and we don't have a preset. We've typed in 512 by 512. Again, if you wanted to do a full HD MPEG, you could, but the animated GIF is fine. You can see where it's rendering to your default images folder. And finally, we'll batch render this. You can just come in the rendering mode, render, batch render, and you'll get 121 frames that you can upload either to Adobe Animate to create your animated GIF. There's the easygif.com animated creator with the application fully online, or you could use Premiere or After Effects to generate a full screen MPEG 4. All right, questions in the tech discussion? Have a good one.